you have a massive trading relationship that has actually even grown larger since political and national security relations have deteriorated. We've seen the trade relationship only grow. So one of the reasons that the prime minister might be reluctant is because there's a lot at stake economically if you start treating China as an enemy.
The Prime Minister is reportedly coming under increased pressure from senior backbenchers to toughen up his stance on China. Now, you'll remember that in a speech last November, Mr. Sunak signalled an end to David Cameron and George Osborne's so-called golden era by calling Beijing a strategic challenge. But now the former Tory leader Ian Duncan Smith has called on him to emulate his predecessor Liz Truss by designating China a threat. And so far, the PM has appeared reluctant to do so. So let's speak to Gabriel Wildau, Managing Director and China Political Risk Analyst and Global CEO of the advisory firm Tuneo. Gabriel, hello.
Hello.
Now, we've had spy balloons, we've had China's proximity to and support for Russia, we've had crackdowns in Hong Kong, persecution of the Uyghur minority. Lots of reasons for a Western country like Britain to declare China a threat. So why would Mr. Sunak hesitate, do you think?
Well, China's relations with the UK and other developed countries have a kind of schizophrenic quality right now, because on the one hand, there are all the issues that you mentioned, which are rightly of concern. And then on the other hand, you have a massive trading relationship that has actually even grown larger since political and national security relations have deteriorated. We've seen the trade relationship only grow. So one of the reasons that the prime minister might be reluctant is because there's a lot at stake economically if you start treating China as an enemy.
Would you say that the Chinese investment and economic relationship with Britain is so close that the UK finds itself in a more uncomfortable position than some of her allies?
I think the UK's allies are actually in quite a similar position because most of them also have major trading relationships. And I think the challenge for all of these countries is to find a way, if you like, to walk and to chew gum at the same time, in the sense of how do you maintain some of the economic relations that I think are beneficial to both sides, while also taking a principled stand against, for example, the human rights issues you mentioned, and also not overstating the threat from some of these issues. I mean, I'm not sure, for example, that these spy balloons posed much of a threat. We know that China and the US and other major powers spy on each other daily. And the experts that I've spoken to say that China's not getting much from these balloons that they couldn't have gotten and that they don't get from their satellites and from other forms of surveillance.
We've got a text that's just coming from Adrian in Darlington, it's part of the UK, and he says, in no way have the Chinese developed this equipment and these tactics in just the last few years. They will have been developing or using them whilst, and he's got a little slur against the former Prime Minister David Cameron and the former Chancellor George Osborne, while they were smarming all over them. What do you think? Is this the case that these tactics, this spying has been going on an industrial scale, but the previous administrations, perhaps of Trump and Obama, and in our country, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, David Cameron, they've known this, but they were so desperate to suckle on the economic breast of China that they have looked the other way?
Well, that's one way of putting it, Henry. But there's a question about how much of a threat this spying poses. So yes, I think you're correct that previous leaders knew about Chinese spying. Previous leaders also conducted spying against China. Spy agencies spied. That is, to state the obvious. It's always been true. Of course, during the Cold War, the U.S. flew spy planes over China. One of them was famously brought down. So I'm not sure if spying is a major threat to UK national security. In fact, in some ways, spying is a way of reducing mutual, relieving some of the suspicions. If you know what the other side is doing militarily or in other domains, you may be less concerned. It's the uncertainty that really makes military planners nervous. And because when you don't know what the other side is doing, you kind of have to assume that the worst. That they may be, about to fire a nuclear weapon at you. I'm exaggerating only slightly,
sure.
But intelligence can actually serve to reduce tensions in many cases because it can disabuse you of your worst fears.
And what reaction do you think Beijing will have, to the pretty hysterical reaction over here about the balloons and the allegations of spying. Will it force them to push back a little bit, or will they take it in their stride?
Well, we are seeing them push back quite strongly. Beijing's initial response was quite measured, and in fact, they expressed regret. They used that exact word, which is not a word you hear from any government, and certainly not from China on a regular basis. They did use that word in their initial response to the balloon incident, but more recently, their rhetoric has hardened, and they seem to be in a defensive crouch. And I think it's not serving their interest, because the U.S. response, at least the official response, setting aside some of the media circus that surrounded it, but the official response from the Biden administration initially was quite measured, and they seem to be willing to get past this incident. As I mentioned, they already knew about these balloons. It was only because this one was flying low enough that civilians could see it from the ground that it became a political issue in the U.S. that Biden administration had to go public with. But they were prepared, I think, to move past this quickly. Unfortunately, though, in the last few days, we've seen China's rhetoric harden, and they're blaming the U.S. for flying balloons over China, and they're taking a very sort of aggressive counterattack type of response. And I think that's going to make it more difficult to move back towards the course we were on before this balloon incident, which was a course towards rapprochement. Following the Biden and Xi Jinping meeting in Bali in November, it looked like relations were stabilizing. That now seems to be derailed, and we're looking for the bottom again in the relationship.
And if Rishi Sunak listened to his former party leader, Ian Duncan Smith, and designated China a hostile state or a strategic threat, or indeed went ahead and arrested the governor of Xinjiang province, where the Uyghur have been persecuted, what do you think that would mean to the Chinese? How would they respond?
Well, that would obviously be a huge escalation. Any kind of arrest of the type you mentioned, I think, would really bring relations to a new low. I think China views Western criticism of its human rights records as meddling in its domestic affairs, and it's these core sovereignty issues, including Xinjiang, including Taiwan, including the other ethnic minority regions like Tibet. These are sort of red line issues for the Chinese government, where they have a very short fuse and a very low threshold for responding angrily when they see meddling coming from the West. And we already had a hint of that a few years ago with the arrest of the Huawei chief financial officer Meng Wanzhou in Canada. That sparked a multi-year diplomatic incident. So I expect UK leaders will be careful about taking such steps lightly.
All right, Gabriel Wildau, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio. Gabriel's Managing Director and China Political Risk Analyst and Global CEO of the advisory firm Tuneo. Coming up